Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the international affairs, foreign policy, and global development community, and world news aficionados of all stripes. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Digital repression is on the rise. Governments around the world have used tools like mass surveillance, internet blocking, and disinformation to stay in power. This includes both autocratic governments and weak or illiberal democracies. New research from my guest today, Steve Feldstein, offers some novel insights into the kinds of digital tools governments are using to consolidate power and for what purpose. He is the author of the new book, The Rise of Digital Repression: How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance. In addition to taking a global view of the topic, the book drills down into several examples and case studies from around the world, including Ethiopia, which we discuss at length towards the end of this episode. The book is very important reading for people who are interested in learning more about the intersection of human rights and digital connectivity. I highly recommend it. The book is both accessible and it's just very interesting. All right, here is my conversation with Steve Feldstein, author of The Rise of Digital Repression: How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance, and senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
So the idea of digital repression is essentially, on a very kind of formal level, is the use of digital information and communications technology to surveil, coerce, or manipulate individuals or groups with a goal of deterring specific activities or beliefs that would challenge the state. Now, this is everything from the use of surveillance to monitor dissidents, to the use of censorship tools to prevent activists from organizing, to the use of like internet shutdowns to prevent the people from mobilizing and communicating via the internet, particularly at moments when there's escalating demonstrations. But it sort of refers to the wide range of digital tools being deployed by governments as a means to enact their repressive agenda.
Is there a general trend that you identified in the course of researching this book in terms of whether or not countries, governments around the world are more frequently using tools of digital repression?
Right. Well, it really seems to be sort of an inevitable part of where the world is heading as more and more people congregate online. And certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated some of these trends. Online has also been the place where people are talking about politics, where they're mobilizing, where if they have problems or criticisms with a particular government, where they'll express those views. And so as a result of that, you see governments more and more looking to the internet and digital communications as a threat or a challenge to their monopoly on power. And so what we've seen, particularly, I think, with the Arab Spring being kind of a signal moment, a widening recognition by states that they need to find better, more sophisticated tools and strategies to control, manipulate, and push back against challengers who operate in the online space. And that they also have to rely upon more sophisticated capabilities in order to track individuals or groups who might present threats to the power of the government. And so you're seeing this pretty widespread. I mean, obviously, there are a few significant case studies, places like China, where there's been a lot of reporting about the use of these tools in pretty jarring ways against individuals. But even in places that are democracies like India, or places that are sort of in the middle, like Turkey, you're seeing a greater use of these tools as a means to push back against those who would challenge the authority of the state.
So we're living in this kind of unique historic moment in which autocracy is ascendant and democracy is in decline. Like, in what ways have tools of digital repression abetted that trend?
Yeah. It's a really tough question to answer. I mean, certainly what we can say is that with the trends of authoritarianism that we're seeing, digital tools have enabled and allowed for a greater amount of power to be vested in those types of autocratic and dictatorial leaders. And so, in other words, it has enhanced their ability to undertake and direct the types of political agendas that they have in ways that exceed what they otherwise would be capable of doing. I think the kind of bottom line question that people are trying to figure out is, are these tools responsible for the resurgence of autocracy around the world? Are these tools actually a key modality that are being used by leaders in order to consolidate power in a way that they otherwise would not be able to without the use of surveillance and censorship and so forth? And I think that takes it a little further than what the facts actually show on the ground. One of the biggest observations and findings I found in my book is that there's a really strong correlation between governments that already have very high pre-existing levels of repression and those that rely upon digital tools to enhance those repressive objectives. So in other words, if you're a country like Turkmenistan or North Korea or China or Russia, and you already have a repressive agenda in place, relying on these tools to further accentuate that agenda is something that you're going to see. Now, does that mean that they wouldn't repress if not for these tools? Probably not. These are countries that already have leadership cliques and regimes that are bent on preserving power at all costs, even if there is pushback and opposition members who would say otherwise. So in that sense, I think these tools are a critical accessory. They're an important complement to and an important aspect to leadership political survival strategies, but I don't know that they're necessarily driving repression or authoritarian resurgence per se.
What about the category of countries that are illiberal democracies like Hungary or Poland? There seems to be a growing number of these kinds of countries around the world. How does digital repression manifest itself in those kinds of countries?
Right. Yeah, so in those countries, you're certainly seeing new pioneering methods and new innovative ways in which they are relying upon these tools to sort of complement what they already are doing. And I think there's a couple ways to think about it. So on the one hand, you're seeing somewhat of a substitute effect. So what that means is that, for example, a country that normally would have to turn to more traditional means of repression, let's say mass incarceration or kind of violently beating protesters, instead of using that, they can substitute out some of those traditional techniques for digital ones. So they can undertake mass surveillance and send threatening email messages. They can use spyware to listen in on communications and then track and lock up particular individuals rather than sort of locking up mass groups of people. And so what that does is that it allows these regimes to be more targeted in who they pursue, but it's still, because they still operate in a quasi open environment, they get to they don't have to deal with the public backlash that otherwise might result if they resorted to more hard-headed tactics. So in a way, it helps them thread this tricky needle between, on the one hand, needing to employ coercion to block challengers, but on the other hand, also needing to preserve a semblance of political freedom in their countries. And so that's kind of where these tools can be a particular advantage.
What would be an example of that, happening in real life, manifesting itself in researching your book?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking that. One of the chapters that I profiled in the Philippines actually is a really good example of that. Thailand also to some extent, but the Philippines is really, for me, the kind of classic hybrid regime, illiberal democracy example. And precisely the reason I chose it as one of my case studies to begin with. So the Philippines, you have a tradition of democracy going back a number of decades, but it's also been a country that's been privy to a lot of corruption and a degree of illiberalism throughout. Kind of rotating between dictators and then elected heads of state. The current president at the moment, Dictator, he hasn't resorted to extreme measures except when it comes to the war on drugs that he's carried out against particular individuals. But other than that, he's more or less allowed the environment to remain open. He hasn't really enacted much surveillance. There's widespread, there isn't really any censorship. But what he has done is he actually used disinformation campaigns and techniques to systematically harass, intimidate, and drive his critics pretty far to make them pretty far removed from his politics. In other words, he's been able to insulate himself and promote his regime in very effective ways, while at the same time really pillorying and criticizing journalists and others and in the opposition who would take him on through the use of very sophisticated disinformation and harassment techniques. And I think in some ways he's pioneered many of the things that we're now seeing in other contexts, including in the US when it comes to some of the far right conspiracy and other disinformation techniques that are permeating in the ecosystem.
I have done a whole episode of this podcast on Facebook's abetting of Duterte's harassment of political opponents and journalists, and how his online hordes have helped him consolidate power in that way. That's I think a really interesting and important example, and also a good point about how it's been exported. It's been sort of tested and tried and true in the Philippines, but exported elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So in the book, you identify this concept of a dictator's digital dilemma. What do you mean by that?
Right. So, the idea essentially is that a lot of countries face a balance between, on the one hand, exerting a significant amount of control using digital technology, and on the other hand, allowing for a considerable amount of openness in order to flourish their economy. And so the dilemma for dictators is, to what extent, if they unleash forces of coercion, if they decide to clamp down on the internet, for example, will that then lead to a parallel effect and hurt the economy? And if it hurts the economy, to what extent does that then undermine their power, thereby undermining the overall premise of why they would clamp down on the internet to begin with? So a good example of this takes place in Thailand, where a few years ago, the junta, the military junta at the time, was proposed to put in place a single internet gateway that would allow them to control all the data and information coming in and out of the country. Now, there were two arguments that were made against this. One was on a human rights argument, that the government shouldn't be allowed to access private data and control people's political freedoms. The other argument was the economic argument, which said, if you do this, international companies and others will flee to other markets in the region, because they'll say Thailand isn't open for business. We don't know, what kind of effect this government will have in our ability on the free flow of commerce, and we're better off going to a place like Singapore or Malaysia or Indonesia, which have more established and more solid rule of law systems. And so the generals saw this backlash, and particularly the economic backlash that was starting to build. They backed off on putting in place the internet gateway, and they decided instead to allow things to continue as is. And that shows very precisely the dilemma that they faced. They wanted to exert more control to preserve their power, and yet they also had to be very careful about not overreaching and thereby cratering their economy.
And the opposite example of that you identify in your book is the case of Ethiopia, which I found to be just a really fascinating chapter in your book. I mean, you have Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who comes to office a few years ago, immediately opens up the country in terms of political liberalization, lets political prisoners out of jail. You have this openness and a far more open online and digital space than that country had ever experienced since the advent of the internet. Yet, as the country kind of has been disintegrating and descending towards civil war in more recent months, you see these familiar tools of digital repression being used. And to me, it's just like a fascinating example of how someone who one might have thought would not be tempted to use such a tool, in fact, when push comes to shove, is in fact using those tools of digital repression, including internet shutdowns.
Right. Yeah, no, it's really interesting with Abiy Ahmed. I mean, he was sort of one of those figures that was like a bit confounding. And I actually, when I visited, which was almost exactly a year ago, I did my field research out there. I mean, I really felt at that point it was sort of on the brink of going either way, and that some of the political gains that had occurred in Ethiopia in terms of like letting people out of prisons, allowing for a flourishing of civil society in journalism were really unprecedented in the country's history. And I think there was a real sense of hope that, Abiy, despite these sort of challenges, including the challenge of Tigray and other kind of minority ethnic groups, that were sort of restive, that he would be able to kind of continue moving Ethiopia on this path of liberalization. And then a few months later, as both COVID kind of clamped down occurred, and then he got embroiled in the conflict in Tigray, things have really gone south in the wrong direction. And so we've seen where, in response to, essentially it was what is a huge challenge to his political power, he's, very much doubled down on the use of internet shutdowns for extended periods. The government is also increasingly using disinformation campaigns and techniques to manipulate what people understand and know, particularly when it comes to the unrest in the north, in Tigray. And then, you have an upcoming election, which was already postponed for about a year, where there's like a lot of concerns about political violence that might sweep, not to mention the fact that, what Abiy's ultimate agenda is going to look like in terms of this like sort of turn back towards repression, frankly. There's a lot of concern about where the country may end up. And these digital tools are kind of right in the middle of a lot of these questions.
Just the idea of like hitting the internet kill switch when you're prosecuting a civil war seems to indicate that you are willing to bear like a great financial burden on your country in order to achieve these whatever tactical gains on the ground you might get from keeping people in the dark about what's happening in one region of the country.
Yeah, that's true. Now, I mean, the one thing I would say is that he hasn't, shut down the internet throughout the country. He's managed to concentrate it just in the region of Tigray, as well as in a few other isolated parts of the country where they're fighting ongoing conflicts. So he has tried to balance out both sides to keep the internet going, in the capital city, Addis, and other parts of the country that are not facing conflict, while specifically shutting it down for months at a time in places like Tigray, Western Oromia, and so forth. And, the other thing, too, that I think is kind of interesting is that, there is this whole question of humanitarian access and the human rights, aspect to connectivity to the internet, in the sense that, not only does shutting down the internet prevent people from communicating and knowing what's happening in their area, it also prevents them from accessing knowledge about where there potentially is conflict that's coming, where there's potentially places that are being bombed, how to access life-saving critical humanitarian assistance, where to get food aid, where to get water, and so forth. And so, the thing that I think the law hasn't kept up with is that the internet isn't just a nice thing to have that allows people to access Google searches and videos. It also has become increasingly a lifeline in terms of giving people necessary information to save their lives in cases where they're in a region that's facing a civil war.
Lastly, I'm interested to learn the extent to which your research suggests that much of what is driving this increase in availability of tools of digital repression, not just in Ethiopia, but around the world, is China being an exporter of these very specific tools that are sometimes used, but also, the idea that one might be able to control a population through such digital means.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the primary questions I explored in my book. What is the effect of China? What role is China playing when it comes to proliferating these tools? And I can say certainly within the policy context in Washington, there's kind of this like general, large acceptance that China is by and large the main driver and the one pushing out intrusive tools around the world and helping essentially authoritarian regimes stay in power. And I found that was not necessarily full, that wasn't a full truth in terms of how I witnessed things. Certainly in the case studies that I went to, where I asked this question specifically to Thai intelligence officials or Ethiopian intelligence officials or Philippines politicians, first and foremost, they pointed to facts on the ground in terms of dictating strategies about why they would use certain tools or not. And so that's an important aspect to really emphasize, that it wasn't that China was saying, hey, Abiy, you should use internet shutdowns or use our surveillance tools so it can better help you repress. It was Abiy making his own decisions based on his own leadership and political calculus. The second thing is that I found that in the countries that I visited, and many other countries as well, Chinese tools are important, but many other types of technology are being supplied by democracies, whether it's the United States or Israel or countries in Europe. And it ranges from censorship tools to surveillance, equipment, to many other sets of things, not to mention the whole disinformation idea we talked about, by and large, relates to US-based platforms. So to call this just a Chinese phenomenon, I think overstates the case in that respect. Finally, a lot of these countries, when they're doing things that are pretty rudimentary and simple, like, shutting down the internet, you don't need Chinese technology to do that. You just need a telecom that'll listen to your instructions and essentially cut off connectivity. That's it. And so, oftentimes you're looking at actually fairly simple, straightforward strategies that don't require a much larger country to provide you with the expertise in order to enact these tactics and to deploy these tools. I mean, it obviously depends on the country you're talking about, but I would say it's an overstatement to say that China is driving, by and large, the digital repression trend. I think there are many more nuances, and they vary on a case-by-case basis depending on what leader and what regime you're referring to.
So I know I said finally before my last question, but this time, finally, what opportunities exist to mitigate against these kind of trends of countries going the digital repression route? What might civil society organizations do, or governments that are true liberal democracies do to support a more open digital space? Yeah.
Well, I really think that the current environment represents more of a cat and mouse struggle than an environment where autocratic governments have a decisive advantage. And I think while at the moment, civil society movements, democratic movements are a little bit on their back foot, that doesn't mean that can't change. And I think there's a few aspects I highlight in the book that I think are really worth thinking closely about. I'll just point to two of them. So one of them is that there are many interesting organizations, grassroots organizations, that are pushing accountability in ways that are really causing trepidation among authoritarian governments. So an outfit like Bellingcat is a great example. Bellingcat is essentially uses open source intelligence to figure out what authoritarian governments are up to, whether it's the Skripal poisonings that Russia has carried out, or the bombing, the missile strike against Malaysian Airlines. They've been able to patch together via mobile phone data, pictures that are posted on the web, and so forth, actual reconstructions of what occurred, and to provide specific evidence of culpability linking back to different authoritarian regimes. And so these citizen-based accountability movements really have potential to change things in terms of keeping governments honest, even if they're authoritarian, because they're able to take away from the monopoly on information and control that these governments are seeking to attain. I think the second thing is that liberal democracies have a lot of tools at their disposal in which to push back. And I think part of the big question is, will the EU, will the United States, will others be able to come together, set some common rules and norms about what is acceptable conduct and what is unacceptable when it comes to the use of these tools for repression, and really begin to enforce those, whether it's through export controls, whether it's through pushing virtuous norms in multilateral forums, whether it's coming together and finding ways to assist groups on the ground who are trying to fight back against repression in places like Uganda or Belarus. But I think there's a lot that can be done in that space as well when it comes to organizing democratically against these authoritarian regimes and using these tools to push back, as much as they are also being exploited by authoritarians to temper and repress citizen movements.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much for your time. Absolutely fascinating book. Thank you so much for your research and for writing this book.
Great. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the conversation.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Stephen. I'll post a link to the book, which was published just a few weeks ago, on the homepage and in the show notes of this episode. All right. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.